Test 1, 2, 3. Test. There we go.
Just like oh, no
All right, a couple quotes up on the board for you guys to think about. Take just a moment to read through those and think about them from the readings. What do you guys think? Any quick reflections on these quotes or the readings before we get ourselves started? I want to prime you for today's class. Yeah.
Cool how the Congress
You have to be louder because I can barely hear you, so no one else can. And I think what you're saying is cool. Go.
It's interesting to see how our views on ethics and ecology have changed throughout the years. We can sort of see a
Trajectory.
yeah.
Cool. Cool. Any other thoughts? Yeah.
Primarily because I think that backdrop itself really highlights how community is made up of a group of individuals who all have their own personal ideas, but come together as a collective. So I think that it's essential for like all communities, like there is that individuality within the community, within the ethnic, like communal agreements and consensus on like different ideas and different topics.
Right. Right. Any other quick thoughts or reflections? All right, well, like I say, that's a bit of a priming because today we're going to talk about environmental ethics as sort of the main subject of our discourse. And I'm hoping that you'll come out of today's class, come out of the readings with a sense of, you know, how different people situate themselves in terms of ethical systems and you know, how there are these very distinct ways of thinking about what it means to be a moral person in this world, and that different people are operating with really different understandings. Not necessarily that one is better than the other, but that people come at the world with these very different perspectives on what it means to be a moral person in the world. So we'll come back to that. There are a couple details I want to talk about, and I'm hoping that we can move quickly enough that that we can do some kind of mini little case studies, because I want you to be able to apply these different perspectives to thinking about things. So here's where we're going to go. There are a few details I do want to talk about. today, just because there are a bunch of different assignments due this week. And there are also a whole bunch of opportunities because it's Earth Day week. Earth Day is on what, Thursday or Friday? Friday. You know, so there's a lot of stuff going on that could be really interesting to many of you, and I want to encourage you to participate. So I sent an email about that, but I'll say a few more things about that. So obviously you have a quiz that was due yesterday. If anyone has any questions, like some people reach out to me and say, oh, I misspelled this word, is that okay? Feel free to do that. I'm good with that. So, you know, if you have a simple spelling error on something, I'm usually pretty flexible on giving you a point for that. So just let me know. Hopefully, how many of you guys have actually conducted your interviews now? Show of hands. Oh, that is awesome. That's great. Okay, great. So people are moving towards that. That's wonderful. If you haven't, you know, get on that. You will be providing each other feedback on those. So important that you get the transcriptions done and you work on extracting quotes. I know Harriet has been very, very good about giving you feedback on your questions as you were moving along, and we'll continue to be good about giving feedback. But this is an opportunity for people in each group to give each other feedback. No one's confused about where things are, how to find things, about the documents that you're supposed to be putting stuff in. Everyone's pretty clear on that. Okay, I won't review that. And some of you have asked me some questions about the case study. Also, some of you asked, hey, could you post that that little modeling tool that Dr. Pafik was using? I did post that immediately after class. So if you go to the class, you know, the readings for that class, all of the case study materials are there. And then I've also posted a link to that model if you want to play with that as you think about things. In the first document that sort of describes the overall scenario, it has a little section at the end of it that explains to you what you're expected to put, the questions you're expected to basically answer in the case study. There are template briefs for each of you, just like the first case study. If you just click on assignments and then click on case studies and click on case study study 2, you will find the template there for you to complete your case study write-up. And within that, I've also copied those questions. So it should be pretty easy for you to find the information associated with the case study. Does anyone have any questions on writing up that case study or where to find things? Because I could go through that quickly, but if people don't have questions, I won't. Any questions on the case study? Like I say, there's a set of questions that you should sort of frame your answers around. People have asked, you know, what should I draw from? You could draw on anything we've read in this class. If you want to use outside resources, you're welcome to. My suggestion for the person responsible for writing the case is that, you know, read the basic background information, do the readings for the class, because there's a lot of good material in it that was assigned for the class. And then, you know, read through each of the different country proposals and then try to address those questions. Your answers do not need to be based on the particular interactions we had in the group. So they don't necessarily need to be based on that. I hope you guys had a fun time. It was very interesting for me. That's the first time for me going through that case. I've used a different case before this year. This is one that Dr. Pafik has sort of recently developed for us. And that's partly why she was here, is because it was a neat experience for me too. And I love the way you guys really got into your country positions. It was super cool. So there is if you look at the schedule for today's syllabus, there's each group should sign up, one sign up per group for your second project conference of the semester. Technically that's due today, but it's fine if you guys get it done for next class. All you need to do for this is figure out, you know, take a look at the times that are available and figure out when the group of you can meet and, you know, fill out times. This is exactly the same as the sign up for the first conference. So please make sure you do that. Yes, Brian. Right, okay. Let me get out of this for a second. if you go to, okay, so if you were to click on the project link, right, so click on the project link, and then if you click, you see conference scheduling form for conference number 2 is right here. Do you guys see that? Right here. So I clicked on that, and then I clicked on this. And what that will be is a set of possible times. I mean, it's can only link you to a Google form, and one member of your group. So what your group should do is just figure out what times you guys can all meet, and then assign one of you to fill in the times when you guys can collectively meet, so that we can assign you to a time for that. Is that sufficient explanation, Brian? It's good. Okay, cool. All right, and you have a modeling module number 3 due. Any questions on anything in terms of assignments? There's a bunch of stuff going on, a lot of complexity, so I just wanted to get that out there. All right, good. So let me talk a little bit before we get into the ethics too about events going on this week, because there are quite a few events this week and next week, and some of them are pretty cool. And kudos to Peyton and Ezra for showing up at a talk that I didn't announce until about an hour before it occurred yesterday. We had a potential visiting professor give a really interesting talk on environmental justice yesterday and climate change. Anyway, I have those photos there because I really want to prime you for helping out with a really fun restoration ecology event we're going to do on Sunday. But first, this is of these events, this is the only one that is required, which is that on your syllabus, we have a tour of this building on Saturday, and we will just meet in the lobby of the building right out there in the atrium at 1 o'clock on Saturday, and do a tour of this building. So that's a thing that's on your syllabus. On Thursday of this week, we're running in environmental studies. We run something called the Careers in the Environment Speaker Series, and what we do is we invite in some alumni of Oberlin College from various different years to come in and talk about basically what they're up to in environmental careers. And we try to organize these around certain themes. And so we have a pair of speakers this week and a pair of speakers next week. And this week's speakers are Benjamin Fram and Lan Sasa, who are going to talk a little bit about the future of renewable energy and kind of trying to finance renewable energy. Should be a very interesting talk at 7:30 to 8:30 on Thursday. That one is on Zoom. The Zoom link, all the information about these things is listed in the email that I sent you earlier. Okay, so that's one thing. There's another Careers in the Environment talk on next week. This one's going to be focused on messaging, kind of environmental media, why the environmental movement needs journalism and media. So that's next week. That should also be really interesting. Again, both of those are Zoom events. This Friday, I'm not going in complete chronological order because the second two are both Careers in the Environment speaker series. If you're interested in kind of connecting not just with what people at Oberlin College are doing, but what the larger community is doing, there's a really neat event that happens once a year. It's a green vegetarian potluck dinner that occurs at a local church, the church on the corner of Tappan Square, First Church. It's fun. A lot of students show up for it. It's neat. It's a great mixing pot for community members and students who are interested in environmental stuff. Again, I provided some details on that. If you're interested in going to that, send me an email and I'll make sure that John Elder, who's organizing that, knows that you're coming. And nice if you can bring something, although frankly, if you just show up, other people will bring enough food that you're good. So that's a thing. And also, I sent you information. Like I said, there's tons going on these next few weeks. I sent you information about tours of the the carbon neutral infrastructure going on. So this ground source geothermal heat pump system that's going on around campus that you experience on a regular basis, but this is your chance to go on a tour and talk with people who are managing this system and learn a little bit more about it. If I'd known they were going to do this, I would have actually required it for the course because it's perfect. But these things weren't announced until about a week ago, so can't really add them. But I strongly encourage you to go. In fact, I'm going to go on today's tour because I'm excited to do that. Because today's tour is a little different from these other tours. So there's like, what is it, 5 different tours that are offered later this semester. Those are going to be by Joel Batens, who's an energy specialist for the college. But this first one is going to be by Michael Ahern, who's one of the principals in Evergreen Energy, which is the consulting company that we've basically hired to build this project for us. So today's is by Michael Ahern, and join me on this. I'm going to go on this tour because I'm really excited to hear what he has to say about the infrastructure. I've been involved in it, but I haven't actually been on a tour of it. So feel free to join me. That one's going to meet sort of in that pathway between Wilder Hall and Warner Hall, and the other ones are meeting in Bibbins. Anyways, everything I've put up so far is all information that was in the email I sent you the other day. So there's like more information in that email, including, for instance, Zoom links to the first, to the careers in the environment sessions. But I really encourage you to do that. Now, finally, I'd love to have some of you helping emeritus professor, David Benzing, and I are going to be leading a wetland restoration project. The little wetland system out here that a lot of you like to have lunch in front of that's full of frogs. It was a little bit warmer. It'd be making a lot of noise right now. Needs some work. It's got a lot of invasive species in it and whatnot. And so David Benzing and I are going to be leading a restoration event on Sunday. You don't need to be there for the full time between 1:30 and 4:30. I sent a link in my email to you that allows you to sign up for times when you could join us, and it'll be a good time. You can actually see on the right-hand side that images of a planting or weeding event from some years back. So this is not the first time we've done this, but you'll learn a lot about wetland restoration in doing that, and you'll get dirty, which will be fun. Okay. Any questions? A lot of announcements. Ezra. That's it. That's it. That's our event. Yeah. Sorry. That's it. Yeah. Okay. Any questions on anything? All right. That was a lot of announcement. I want to kind of get into the meat of today's discussion and have this conversation about ethics and ethical systems. And maybe I'll take a little bit of a step back and say something that I probably said at the start of this course is this is a super interdisciplinary course that covers a lot of topics. And for all of us teaching it, we're all sort of stretching into different disciplines because none of us are trained with this sort of breadth of background. And I'm a natural scientist by training, so a lot of my research and thinking is it's actually at this point about both natural and social sciences. It's more the humanists of the world who think about ethical systems and that sort of thing. But one of the ideas that is fundamental to the field of environmental studies is this notion that it's important for all of us to understand these different ways of thinking about human relationships with the natural world. And a very important perspective, even for those of us who are focused on natural sciences, is, what's the nature of good and evil in the world with respect to human relationships with the environment? What sort of moral system are we applying? Because whether we are focused on ethics or focused on what we think are other things, all of us are operating with certain assumptions about the nature of relationships among people and between people on the planet. And if you're going to have a conversation with someone, or more importantly, if you're going to try to change the world in a way that you think is positive, it's very important for you to understand where you're coming from in terms of your own ethical beliefs, but equally, perhaps more important, maybe not more important, but equally important to understand where the people you're interacting with are coming from in terms of their own worldviews about the nature of good and evil and people's relationship with each other. And I think an important thing to maybe sort of say as a preface to this, most cultures, most ethical systems in the world have a basis for protecting the environment. But oftentimes, where they come from in terms of their basis for protecting the environment is very different. And as with many things, it's important to be respectful of where other people are coming from. And if you understand where they're likely coming from a place that's different from you, but if you understand where your own philosophies and thinking about the world align, oftentimes it's easier to get to a desirable, mutually satisfying, beneficial place if you're really kind of understanding what motivates them, what they think is sort of like, good and evil, right and bad action in the world. Ethics is all about sort of thinking about what is good and bad action. It's a system of moral principles that people operate with. And it's a branch of philosophy that deals with values relating to human conduct with respect to the rightness and wrongness of certain actions, to the goodness or badness of motives and ends of such actions. So, at some level, like I say, all of us either implicitly or explicitly are making decisions that we justify as being good or bad, right or wrong. And there are different ways to come at that understanding of what is good and bad and right and wrong. And important to understand where different people are coming from with respect to their understandings of what's good or bad and right and wrong. And there are some kind of key questions that the different ethical systems sort of ask of the world. And one of the key questions is, what things out there, what entities out there deserve moral standing? What is it that deserves moral standing? And that comes down to a fundamental question of these two concepts. One is intrinsic value. Something with intrinsic value is something that has value in and of itself. Like, as an obvious example, we usually think most philosophies of the world see human beings, individual human beings, as having intrinsic value. They have value in and of themselves. Their value is not simply because they're useful for some purpose for someone else, but we sort of extend this idea of a human being has an intrinsic value to themselves. The contrasting sort of way of thinking about the value of something is instrumental value. So something that has instrumental value has value related to its effect on entities that have intrinsic value. It's a little bit complicated, but it's actually not that complicated. So a good example, I think, of this is people's attitude towards animals, for instance. There are many, I'm guessing, of you who feel as though animals have intrinsic value. As living beings, they have certain rights. Whether they're human beings or not, they have certain intrinsic value as a living being. And oftentimes, the way we decide whether something has value, or philosophers traditionally decided this, is whether the animal is capable of suffering. And oftentimes, we think of those organisms that we can clearly see as capable of suffering as having intrinsic value. So the ability to experience pain and suffering is in philosophy oftentimes a characteristic that we use to determine whether something has intrinsic value. But there are many cultures out there that really see animals as fundamentally only having instrumental value. They have value because they provide human beings with products or services, or that's their value. And a good example of that locally, I think, would be the Amish community, which lives a lot of Amish people living in Ohio, who really see human beings as having this sort of fundamental value. And this is obviously, in this situation, it's very much caught up in religion. the idea that human beings are made in God's image. Other organisms are not made in God's image. Morality is all about human beings. It's not about other animals. And the other animals of the world have value to human beings. And so their value, they may be quite valuable. And they may be of considerable value, but their value has to do with the sort of benefits they provide to human beings. They don't have an intrinsic value. They have an instrumental value. So they don't necessarily have a moral standing as an animal. They have moral standing in and of the fact that they provide instrumental value to human beings. So to harm the animal could be morally reprehensible if it ends up hurting human beings who are dependent on that animal. So there'd be a moral calculus in someone doing harm to the animal, but that moral calculus would be contingent on the impact of a negative action on the animal, on the human being who's somehow dependent or benefits from that animal. Does that make sense? Yeah. So the kind of key question when we're thinking, at least when we're thinking about things from an environmental perspective, a key question is, what are the grounds on which we extend moral standing to other entities? What's the decision-making process that different groups of people might undergo in making that choice about, yes, that thing has moral standing, that thing has intrinsic value, this thing has extrinsic value, it doesn't have moral standing. So one of the readings for today by Caldecott kind of goes through a series of different moral philosophies and how they conceptualize this issue of moral standing. So that's kind of where I'm focusing right now. And I will say different people use some slightly different terminology. We'll go ahead and use the terminology from the reading. But one of the groups he characterizes, one of the ethical groups he characterizes is ethical humanism. So as a branch of philosophy, ethical humanists are pretty much associated with sort of traditional Western ethical system. And here the sort of focus level is on human beings and human society as the fundamental center of entities with moral standing, let's say. And the argument is that, human beings are uniquely rational, uniquely self-aware. They're able to consider the future. For some people coming from a religious standpoint, they are made in God's image. And so in this particular philosophy, ethical humanism, moral standing is really only granted to human beings because we're sort of this unique, we're a unique group. And so I have this little magnifying glass because the sort of focal areas on human beings. And so the fundamental questions that we ask are, when we consider the goodness or badness of an action, we consider its impact on human beings. Like how's it affecting human beings? And it's what sort of helps us decide whether a particular action is good or bad. And some people call this anthropocentric ethics because obviously it's focused on human beings. Anthropocentric meaning focused on humans, because plants, animals, the non-living world are seen as having instrumental value, which again, it doesn't mean that they're not important. You could, and many people do, build a worldview that very much is in favor of protecting the environment based on this particular attitude. And you see this oftentimes in certain Christian attitudes that speak to the importance of preserving God's creation. Sort of seeing the non-human portion of the world as God's creation. And although it may not have intrinsic value, it was created for human beings. And so protecting it so that it continues to provide benefits to human beings is seen as potentially a very important thing. And in fact, you could look at nature to the extent that nature is a necessary condition for human beings to enjoy life. You could look at nature as being this sort of sacred thing, even though it doesn't have intrinsic value. Its extrinsic value is considerable because it provides a context for human beings to live a good life. And so you might be in favor of, doing everything in your power to address climate change, because human beings will suffer if climate change occurs. They will suffer if they don't live in a beautiful environment that has clean air, clean water. So I'm just saying there's nothing about a human-centered view which is in conflict with a strong desire to protect the natural environment. It's just a way that one perceives and recognizes and frames the moral standing of things here. Okay, so another view in ethics is humane moralism. So we just talked about ethical humanism. Now we're talking about humane moralism. So humane moralism is based on thinking about sentient organisms in general, and focusing not just on human beings, but on any organism that can think and that has some capacity for thinking, and more importantly than that, that can experience pain and suffering. And this philosophical view really kind of looks at pain and suffering as the principal evil in the world, and that it's a moral system that tries to minimize pain and suffering in the world. And since other organisms can experience pain and suffering in this view, it looks at humans and other animals that are capable of experiencing. And different people in this group might extend it to different groups of organisms. Whether you're extending this to insects, to the mosquito that's sucking your blood, or whether you're extending it to what those of us in ecology refer to as charismatic megafauna, the organisms that look kind of like us and are furry and we can empathize with. Different people might extend to different ranges, where you go with like a bacteria or other, one-celled or simple multi-celled organisms that don't really have the capacity to think. There's slush, and like where you're going to draw the line in terms of being a humane moralist. And there are certainly humane moralists out there who would not swat a mosquito on their skin because they feel like that would be a reprehensible thing to do. But many people coming at the world from this viewpoint are very critical of anthropocentric ethics, and sometimes they refer to it as human chauvinism or speciesism, that sort of thing. So that's a thing. Very often, animal rights activists, of which some of you may be animal rights activists, kind of have this as kind of an underpinning. The sort of cruelty to farm animals in particular, and other animals used for testing, human products and stuff, looking upon that as being, fundamentally reprehensible because of the suffering and pain that's inflicted upon these animals, and see that as a great evil in the world that really must be addressed for ethical reasons. So that's often an underlying principle of animal rights activists. So earlier on in this class, and so those are sort of two very traditional views of thinking about morality, thinking about it from the perspective of humans are unique, or there are other animals that we extend moral rights to because they're also capable of pain and suffering. But earlier in this class, we talked about this idea of levels of organization in systems, and we talked about these different views. The reductionist view, which is sort of a worldview based on sort of individual parts of a system, and the holistic view, which sort of puts forward this notion that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, and there are interactions between parts that are important to understanding the behavior of the whole in the system. And and this idea too of emergent properties, that there are some properties of systems that are only evident above the individual levels of the components involved here. Might seem weird that I'm sort of introducing these concepts as we talk about ethics. Why is this relevant? Help me out here. Why am I going on what might seem like a side branch here Yeah, Ezra.
Discussions we have, I think is kind of like more reasoning why like development is essentially giving their money away to minority developing countries. So like I think like that sense of like looking at it in an ethical perspective of like, should we be doing this for the benefit of other people, or like these are also people, so maybe we should.
Yeah, so interesting, sort of like this idea of groups of people, societies that have different access to resources, live in different parts of the world. Or, yeah.
I was just kind of pondering the question, like, for what species might go extinct because of the results of our actions, or the impacts that we're going to have on, you know, not just ourselves, but other organisms on the planet, and like just kind of considering that, because maybe, you know, we could go further with using like technology and whatever to survive even with the changing planet, while other species won't be able to do that. So it's just kind of thinking about that.
Right, right. So thinking about how do other organisms fit in. Any other thoughts on this? Well, it's going to bring us to sort of our next branch of philosophy, the sort of systems approach. And to talk about that, I really kind of need to focus on an individual who was important in at least sort of Western culture, beginning to think about how systems fit into ethical systems. In fact, as we'll get to shortly, many native peoples in the world were kind of already where Aldo Leopold, took certain portions of Western civilization in their thinking. So I don't want to put this forward as some sort of radical new idea by a Western ecologist or philosopher, but definitely an idea that was kind of introduced to Western culture, inserted into the ethical discussion only really in this last century, and principally by this guy Aldo Leopold, who sort of an interesting character. Actually, native of Iowa, so he's a Midwesterner. From my perspective, interesting from my background, because he was one of the first students at Yale School of Forestry, which is where I got my master's degree. So, I sort of lived in the wake to some extent of the work of Aldo Leopold. But interesting character in that much of his career was actually focused on wildlife management and ecology. But he's sort of credited for founding a field of ethics. So the guy kind of got around. He actually started many different fields. Wildlife ecology, he wrote an important textbook in that, game management. Ecosystem management, one of the first people to really talk about managing whole ecosystems. Restoration ecology, the whole field of restoration ecology, which really began during World War II, kind of efforts to actually during the Depression, the Work Progress Administration in the United States created a lot of different projects, and some of those projects focused on restoring ecosystems, and Aldo Leopold was put in charge of trying to restore prairie ecosystems and really sort of founded the whole field of restoration ecology. As I say, this weekend we'll be doing some restoration ecology out in that wetland, and at some level we have Aldo Leopold to credit for founding that field. But also this field that sort of became known as environmental ethics. You did a reading for today taken from a compilation of his work called Sand County Almanac, which you just did one reading for today, but actually you've done a previous reading, the reading on Adam X we did much earlier in the semester, Odyssey, the essay Odyssey. But this guy really is sort of credited with introducing environmental ethics into the traditional ethics systems and really kind of transforming things. And like I say, interesting life history in the sense of kind of coming at all of this from originally a sort of scientific management centered perspective, and then sort of shifting to the ecosystem, to an ethical perspective on this. So all of that is a bit of introduction to introduce this sort of third way of thinking about ethical systems, about whether a thing is right or wrong. and considerations of that. And Leopold is famous for what's referred to as the land ethic, or what some people refer to as an ecocentric, as opposed to anthropocentric, and ecocentric perspective on ethics. And here, the focal level, instead of being on human beings, instead of being on organisms that experience sentience, the focal level is on an entire community. And so that kind of connects with the comments that were being made about sort of thinking about climate change, but thinking about its effect on whole communities, not just on individuals. So here the focal level, again, is the ecosystem, the entire biotic community, and the moral standing of a part. This is what's really radically different, is this notion that the moral standing of an individual component of that ecosystem is contingent on its contribution to the larger whole, to the integrity of the biotic community. So we're judging the goodness and badness of action in a much more complicated way in this particular worldview. It's a much more complicated thing, because we're thinking about when we take an action with respect to an individual entity, we're not focused strictly on the experiences of that entity. We're focused on that entity's relationship with the larger whole. So it takes into account all of what we talked about in terms of systems, of the whole being greater than the sum of its parts. When we look at a part, we're seeing, how does it relate to the whole? How does it connect with the whole? And sometimes this is referred to as an ecocentric ethical perspective, the land ethic as an ecocentric ethical perspective, because we're considering individual components. And if it can be reduced to a single statement, it's a statement that Leopold makes in the land ethic, in which he says, a thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of a biotic community. It's wrong when it tends otherwise. And some people would extend this beyond. They would take the word biotic out and say, that statement could be said about any kind of community, whether it being a social community, an economic community. So you can kind of think about it as that statement potentially encompassing, the sort of sustainability notion of there being these intersecting systems of economic, social, and environmental systems. A thing is right and good when it preserves the integrity and stability, sounding very much like the notion of sustainability, or even resilience and beauty of the biotic community. It's wrong when it tends to do otherwise. So it's a very contextualized understanding of the nature of goodness or badness. And as I said earlier, as a preface to this, oftentimes when, in an academic environment like this, we tend to be coming from this sort of Western cultural perspective. But just to point out that what he was saying was entirely consistent, and one might say derivative of, although I'm not sure the extent to which he was aware of this, of statements that are made by Native peoples. This famous statement by Oren Lyons, chief of the Onondaga Nation. We're looking ahead, as is one of the first mandates given to us as chiefs, to make sure and to make certain every decision that we make relates to the welfare and well-being of the 7th generation to come. What about the 7th generation? Where are you taking them? What will they have? So you can really see in this, this notion of considering now in the context of future, in the same way as considering individual component in the context of system. Time, space, they're pretty much interchangeable with each other. It's essentially the same statement made far earlier than Leopold made it. So again, focal level ecosystem, moral standing of individual is related to contribution of the whole, and we're considering scales of time as well as sort of levels of organization. So we're thinking about all of these things collectively. So let me just try to take a step back and take these 3 ethical systems and do some like direct comparison among them. just so we're clear on where these are, where the similarities and differences are. So when we think about moral standing being extended beyond just human beings, both the humane moralist perspective and the land ethic take that perspective that things that are not human beings may have moral standing. For humane moralists, it would still be focused on organisms. The question would be whether certain organisms, again, using animal rights as an example of that, looking at factory farming, the treatment of animals, and so just coming to the conclusion that it's morally wrong that these animals are suffering in this environment, and we should make efforts to prevent that from happening. The land ethic would also be extending moral standing to these organisms. It might also be extending moral standing to whole ecosystems, not just organisms within the ecosystem, and thinking about relationships. But again, both of them going beyond just thinking about human beings, as ethical humanists would strictly focus on human beings as the sort of level there. So this, though, is sort of the commonality between a focus on individual organisms. Both ethical humanism and humane moralism are focusing on organisms. Are organisms experiencing pain or pleasure in a particular situation? So some similarities and differences between these different perspectives. Let me just stop there for a moment, because again, what we're doing today is a little different from what we've done in other classes. And just ask if anyone has any questions, thoughts, things they'd like to get out there. Yeah.
Is it possible for different ethics to kind of intertwine with one another?
Sure. You mean for an individual, you or someone else in this class, to say there are aspects of these different moral systems that resonate with me? I can see, sure, why not? I'm not, if it's not already obvious, I'm pretty enamored of the land ethic and ecocentrism. To me, that's what really resonates with me. But that doesn't mean that I don't, value the perspectives, particularly of humane moralism, and sort of feel like there's something morally wrong about causing an animal to suffer, regardless of the particular context that the animal is in. I don't have a problem seeing that as problematic, and seeing that as, so I don't think we need to sort of envision the world as you occupy only one of these camps. Like many things, I think it's useful to sort of like put these out there as poles to sort of see, to sort of understand where they're coming from. But I don't see any problem with your situating yourself in some sort of mix of these different things. And many people might also say, well, human beings are unique, and there are certain aspects that really are unique, and pain and suffering of human beings is different than pain and suffering of animals, because we are human beings. So I think you could probably occupy at some level all of these moral worldviews, if you chose to. Other thoughts? Yeah.
Is Leopold the one that is okay with hunting?
Leopold's absolutely okay with hunting. Yeah, he wrote the book on game management, which was very much about hunting, because from his perspective, that's what animals do. Predators are necessary. He situates human beings as being part of the ecosystem. So in the same sense that, a lion's existence is sort of contingent on hunting. And not only is the lion's existence contingent on hunting, the prey species existence is contingent on being hunted, because the lion is, culling out the sick animals, and it's an ecosystem. There's a relationship there, like everything's dependent on everything else. And I think Leopold is situating human beings within that ecosystem, not outside that ecosystem. And, saying human beings being engaged as predators in an ecosystem is not a bad thing. The question for him is human beings' engagement in the system managing the system in a way that is participating in benefits to the whole? So, for instance, I was actually, let me, yes, go ahead. I feel like I kind of want to do this mini case study because I feel like a lot of the discussion we will have will come out of here. So I want to do several of these. So I just want to spend like a minute or two on this, but I'm sticking a scenario out in front of you. And what I'm asking you to do as members of this class is to take these 3 different ethical perspectives and try to apply them to the same situation. So I'm gonna read this to you. And then I want you to think about and describe to us as a class how you think these different people occupying these different ethical viewpoints would look at this situation and how they might respond to the problem. So again, I want you to think about this from the ethical humanist perspective. Again, that's the sort of very human-centered one. The humane moralist perspective, that's the one that looks at organisms that are capable of experiencing pain and suffering and extends moral rights to them. And the land ethicist who's looking at sort of the systemic issues. And okay, so those are the 3 perspectives. So I'll just read this. As a combined result of human removal of natural predators and increased habitat, and also you're right, also human induced, there are more white-tailed deer in the continental US than there were when European settlers first arrived. That's a true statement. This results in a number of problems for humans and the environment. For instance, deer overpopulation results in excessive browsing that severely damages forest ecosystems. Deer also consume agricultural crops and can cause substantial economic losses for farmers. Finally, deer are a major hazard on roads and result in thousands of highway fatalities each year. Hunting, birth control, and introduction of predators are some of the options considered and employed, oops, that's misspelled, as control measures. So this is a statement of a set of facts here, and I want you to think about how these different ethical, just take a moment to think about that, and then actually chat with your group members for a moment. I want you to come to some sort of consensus on how these different worldviews would see, and maybe what they would do if you consider this a problem. And I think everyone considers what's described in here problematic. There are problems in here. How would you approach these problems, solving these problems from different standpoints? So I'll give you a couple of minutes to think and then just chat about that with your fellow group members. They can shoot little darts at them with birth control in them, or put them out temporarily with a stun and insert basically Norplant type deal under their skin so that they are not harmed. They're okay, but they do not reproduce. It is actually used. It is active. All of these things are very actively used. I had when I was in graduate school at Yale School of Forestry, I won't call him a friend because he wasn't really a friend, but a colleague of mine, a fellow student, he was basically a sharpshooter. And his job, he was making his way through grad school by shooting deer in urban locations, because he was a very good marksman, so he wasn't going to shoot some person by accident. So he was hired to go out there and basically shoot deer that were causing a lot of damage. So I think he was also involved in deer birth control issues as well. That's sort of what he was studying. So these are very real things. Yeah. Yeah. Make sure you're circling through these different ethical perspectives and discussed each of them. I only want to give you another minute, so just make sure if you haven't covered one, you cover it. All right, I know you guys are having a good discussion, but I actually want to get to some others. I want to get to some other stuff. So I'm just gonna sort of pick on people. Ella, I'm gonna ask you, how would an ethical humanist kind of view this situation?
Well, we were talking about how an ethical humanist can kind of view it as like a human problem, so it needs to be fixed to help humans. So regulating deer population in some way would kind of show humans that.
What are the problems in an ethical, if looking at these things, what would an ethical humanist identify as the bads going on here? Like what do they see as the harms?
Just like the road, I think the roads thing.
Yeah, so people getting hurt on roads, it's hurting human beings. That's bad for human beings. What else might they see here as bads that are affecting humans in this situation? Yeah, go ahead.
Like
Economic losses too. So the damage to the crops, that sort of thing. So deer are causing a problem that is harming something that has ethical standing, human beings. And so, Ella, what sort of actions might make sense from that perspective?
Anything that regulates deer population. If you did do hunting, then you could also use the deer to like feed people, which would help.
Good. Yeah, right. So potentially, and there are some states, by the way, where they will, where animals that are culled this way will be provided to prisoners, and I think sometimes there's USDA issues involved in these things because it has to be certified to feed it to people. But also to food shelters. I think there are states that have done that as well for these situations. But okay, good stuff. Maeve, what about the sort of humane moralist perspective?
Our group talked about the birth control method because it wouldn't be harming the deer, which should be the main focus of a humane moralist, but it would still address the problem.
Right. So the humane moralist is obviously worried about the suffering of the deer and probably wouldn't be so on board with them being shot. Right. But also doesn't want them to suffer from, probably is worried about the deer getting hit, but is worried about both the people, but also the deer and their experience of pain. So they would understand that, you know, there's a situation that needs to be addressed here. But yeah, I think probably, I think you're probably right that the birth control might be a favored approach for that one. Okay. Anyone want to do land ethicist view on this? Land ethicist perspective? Yeah, go ahead.
I think the land ethicist will be doing, you know, conserving land in natural ways, and by also introducing, you know, restoring their real habitats, just not like space wide, but also by introducing, you know, the methods, you know, the food chain, introduce the natural predators, so that, you know, they'll balance it for, you know, the herbivores.
Yes, so maybe reintroduce some predators, for instance. And we've certainly seen a lot of that with sort of wolves out west, this enormous controversy over reintroduction of wolves in the Yellowstone area, and real conflict between farmers and you know, proponents of reintroduction of rules, trying to create a more natural system for controlling these things, but not necessarily opposed to other measures like hunting, because obviously this describes damage to the ecosystems, excessive browsing that severely damages forest ecosystems. So recognizing that the deer, the overpopulation of deer, is having a negative impact on the ecosystem, and therefore, perhaps most desirably through natural predators, but also potentially through human beings. And maybe they'd be particularly on board if the humans were eating the animals, so that there was food value coming out of it for human beings. So that would be more sort of natural ecosystem oriented. All right, nice job. Anyone else have something they want to contribute to this? Any other thoughts on this? Yes. Claire. Right. Well, it turns out the deer actually, there's a very complicated story about deer. The native peoples, we sort of think about this, we have this Western idea about this landscape being somehow natural, not influenced by humans when the European settlers showed up. In fact, the native peoples were very intensively managing the New England landscape, at least, for deer, because they like to eat the deer. And so they were actually burning forests, creating the deer, the forest is habitat for them, but they really like fields. And in fact, they love corn. And now I'll really situate myself and maybe even gross you guys out by saying this. Do you guys want to be grossed out by me or not? No? Yes or no? We'll have hands here. Okay, well, it's not that gross actually. When I lived in Maryland, I kind of decided I was going to, my only source of meat would be animals that I could harvest myself, mostly roadkill deer. So during my graduate experience, that's basically the meat I ate, was roadkill deer. And I bring that up because when I would, I would only do it in the winter when it was cold out, because they'd get knocked down and basically they wouldn't be able to rot because it'd be cold weather. I do it when it was below freezing. Anyway, when I would butcher them, which I would do in my living room, yeah, okay, so that's a little gross. They were always, their bellies were always absolutely full of corn. That's what they were eating. Basically, deer in Maryland, which really are overabundant. I mean, they are everywhere. They're basically, their habitat is basically cornfields. That's what they're living off, at least in my region of Maryland. They were living off corn, human cornfields. That's what they lived off. Anyway, that was probably more than you wanted to know about me, but there you go. All right, I want to shift gears a little bit here before going into some other cases and talk a little bit about environmental justice. As a bit of a preface towards, you want to say something? Yes. Yeah.
So when we back to the intricacies of like our society and whatnot, like looking at ethical humanists, would there be levels to that, given that even though ethical humanists believe that humans are like the focal point of our society, since some people do have like beliefs that other human beings are higher than
Right. Well, that's a really good question. It actually, I think, forms a nice transition into talking about environmental justice, because that has been a real issue. You think about Western culture as putting forward this idea of ethical humanism as humans having fundamental moral standing. But I think the reality is for most of Western culture, not all humans have been considered the same way as each other, and not all humans have been granted the same level of value. So I think that is a key transition to talking about this issue of environmental justice. I think if one were a strict ethical humanist who really did fairly extend value to all human beings, like I say, I happen to like occupy a certain space within these ethical views because it just makes some intuitive sense in my worldview. But I really do believe that each of these ways of thinking about the world could result in a world that all of us occupying these different perspectives would find just. I feel like there's easy convergence among necessary actions to take, but there is this fundamental question about if you're going to focus on human beings as your fundamental entity of moral standings, are you being fair in terms of the way you're valuing different human beings? And that really is central to this issue of environmental justice. And there were quite a few readings on this, so I'm not going to completely rehash this, but the analysis, the sort of fundamental, essential analysis, the environmental justice perspective is that different groups of people have different degrees of power, different degrees to control what's happening in the world around us. So that's just a fact. I think there are very few people who would disagree with that statement, that different groups of people have very different access to power and degrees to exercise power, and that practices and policies of those who are in power result in differences in environmental benefits and burdens to different groups of people. So different groups of people, and the benefits and burdens components of this are important because we're talking about both access to environmental benefits and harms caused by things. And just to give you two very quick examples, which have had considerable research and media attention in recent years. Urban trees are an issue that people are beginning to really think a lot about, and there have been many recent studies, and I'm working with some colleagues in Cleveland that I've been interacting with a great deal, and people have discovered, not surprisingly, or at least quantified recently, that if you look at urban locations, the tree cover, the shading tree cover is disproportionately allocated to affluent communities. Same deal with access to parks in general, disproportionately allocated to more affluent and whiter people, and areas without trees disproportionate in neighborhoods that are poor and people of color. So that's a benefit side of thing. The burden side of thing, which I'll talk more about too, relates to issues like pollution and people, it's lower income people of color who are disproportionately living in communities that have negative environmental aspects, burdens like lead pollution, particulates in the air, what have you. So those are sort of analyses, but really simply observations that's a fact. It's easy to quantify those facts. But there are two types of equity we're sort of considering here when we're thinking about environmental justice that are important to think about. One is distributive justice. That is how are benefits and burdens distributed across different groups of people. That's mostly what I've been talking about so far, is distributive justice. How are the benefits and burdens associated with the environment, good or bad things, distributed across different groups of people? But the other aspect of this is participatory justice, which is who's making the decisions. So it's two sides of this that are slightly different from each other. Who's experiencing the benefits and the burdens, and who's participating in making decisions, who's in control, who's exercising power in this system. And this sometimes goes by some different names. There's some different jargon that gets used for these things. Sometimes people call this procedural justice, who's involved in making the procedures. So participation, procedures, same differences. Different people use different terms for these things. By the way, just an extra instant bonus point here. Does anyone know who these two gentlemen are? They're very important figures here. Yeah, Ezra. Yes, this is Cesar Chavez, who's famous for what? Yes, organizing immigrant farm workers in the 1970s. And the interesting thing is, we have this trope that the environmental movement is somehow dominated by, the history of the environmental movement is dominated by upper middle class white people. To some extent, that's a question of how we're defining the environmental movement. When we think of Cesar Chavez, most people the first thing they would say is labor activist. But in fact, what was he organizing against? Among other things, he was organizing against the fact that immigrant workers were being subjected to toxic farm chemicals in their work. They were experiencing environmental injustice, and that was one of the principal things that the Farm Workers Union was organizing against. Anyone know who the fellow on the right is there? His name is Robert Boulard. People often credit him as sort of the father of the study of environmental justice, a sociologist who did a lot of work sort of quantifying environmental injustice in the world. So he's often seen as kind of a founding figure of the academic field of studying environmental justice, and also the movement of addressing environmental injustice. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about these different kinds of justice here. Distributive justice, like I say, is focused on how are environmental benefits and burdens distributed among different groups of people, among different regions. So who, in terms of groups, is being affected, who, in terms of spatial regions, is being affected, but also this very important question of across generations, who's being affected, which I think has really emerged, especially with the climate. Climate has distributive justice issues, obviously people on coastlines, people in low-lying areas, people in the global south who don't have the same access to irrigation systems. Those are sort of groups of people and regions that are disproportionately negatively affected by climate change. But if you look at an activist like Greta Thunberg, her principal arguments have more to do with intergenerational justice, that the people benefiting from emitting fossil fuels now are harming future generations, and that it's an intergenerational justice issue as well as being an issue of spatial justice. So, but all of these are issues to think about as we do this. So we're considering, what different groups of people are affected by decisions that we're making right now. What different regions are affected. This is a map of sort of poverty levels in the United States. High poverty levels, lower poverty levels. So obviously there's disproportionate poverty in the United States. So among different regions and across generations, again, who's being affected by these decisions. And it's not the generational issue is a little bit more complicated than you might think, because when we think about, for instance, when we did our climate vulnerability assessment in Oberlin and considered who's going to be most affected by the changes that are in the pipeline in the next 20 years, one of the groups that we found ourselves most concerned about was who? See if you can fill in that blank, given what I'm saying. Yes.
Children and old people.
Yes, children and old people. So it's not strictly about, the Greta Thunberg, you're destroying our future. It's also who's most vulnerable to heat days over 90 degrees, the increase in number of days over 90 degrees. Well, old people, especially poor old people who are prone to respiratory problems and just are generally more immunocompromised than the rest of us, or further along on that trajectory of immunocompromisedness. Okay, so that's the distributive justice side. The participatory justice side is, about who's engaged in the decision-making process for these things, who participates in decision-making. And we've talked about this notion that there are these sort of scales of humans interacting with the natural environment. We sort of shifted these scales, and so that kind of fits with this notion that benefits and burdens, what we see as benefits and burdens, are really kind of unequally distributed across both time and space. Here, this is a map of a section of the Mississippi River, which is known as Cancer Alley because it's full of petrochemical industries that release nasties into the environment and harm local peoples. And as some of you are quite familiar with. These communities are dominated by poor people and people of color. So and they exercise very little control over factories coming in and exerting this effect on community. So sometimes when we talk about environmental justice, we get a little bit more specific and talk about environmental racism directly, which so objectively for many years, people talked about how lower income people there's a strong correlation between income level and the amount of sort of exposure to environmental negatives like toxic waste and particulates in the air and those sorts of things. In recent years, people have done a pretty good job of quantifying the fact that above and beyond simply income levels, race is a strong determinant of whether you're living in a region that disproportionately experiences environmental negatives. Race has a stronger effect on exposure to pollutants than poverty, that is. So it's not simply that more people of color are poor and poor people experience this. It's beyond that. It's been very well documented now. Disproportionate proximity to landfills, hazardous waste industry, a higher pollution exposure to lead than other pollutants, disproportionate impact of climate change. So at this point, this is quite well documented and acknowledged by our federal government. It's not something that there's dispute by among those people who actually quantify things. Results of national, state, and county scales all indicate that non-whites tend to be burdened disproportionately to whites. So I just want to be very clear about that this is beyond just an issue of poverty. It's specifically an issue of race in terms of disproportionate negative impacts of environmental bads. Okay, I have another case I kind of want to throw in front of you. We only have a few minutes, but let's at least think and chat a little bit about this, a sort of mini case here. So this is a situation which is there. If you look at the globe from satellites and you look down on North Carolina, what you will see in many regions of North Carolina is something that looks like a moonscape, because there's this enormous production of hog farms where they pen up pigs and grow pigs, and the waste from the pigs, which extraordinarily is not regulated in the way that human waste is regulated, although it's basically quite similar in its impacts on the environment, are sort of managed in lagoons. And let me just read this scenario to you, and I want you to think about how these different ethical perspectives might think about this and how it relates to environmental justice. A hog farming operation in coastal North Carolina relies principally on immigrant labor from Latin America. Workers are exposed to long hours and exposed to high levels of ammonia, which is toxic. Many other community members are low-income people of color who do not run hog farms. The farms keep animals in close quarters, and animal waste is stored in large lagoons. Periodically, the lagoons flood and release nutrients that travel into the local estuary, causing phytoplankton blooms, and then deplete the water of oxygen and lead to death of fish and shellfish and interfere with the enjoyment of beaches by humans. The stench of the area is severe. So, because we're out of time, just take a moment as you leave and think about, like, how would these different ethical perspectives situate themselves, and how does this relate to this issue of environmental justice? And then on Thursday, I'll be very pleased to be introducing my colleague, Jay Fischio, who focuses on environmental humanities, so issues of ethics and issues of justice, to talk a little bit about her work and her perspective. So, all right.
Thank you.
Yeah. Take care, Chris.
I will be done with it. Right.